The sky above Nevada doesn't forgive. It watches, endless and patient, as men try to pierce it with metal and hubris, and sometimes, just sometimes, it swallows them whole without a trace, leaving only questions scratched into logbooks that no one will read for 50 years. On July 24, 1955, a silver needle threaded through that unforgiving blue, call sign Phantom, pilot unknown to history but known to the void. His U-2 spy plane climbed past 20,000 feet, then 30, then somewhere the altimeter stopped making sense and the world below became a memory rendered in ochre and shadow. The controls shuddered. Not mechanical failure, something else. He wrote later, in margins the CIA would redact with black ink thick as tar. The sky here doesn't end, it just swallows you whole. That's the hook, isn't it? Not the plane, the swallowing. Imagine standing where he took off, Groom Lake, a place that existed on no map your father could buy at a gas station. A dried wound in the Mojave where Joshua trees twisted like penitents, and the air tasted of metal and old sins. July heat turned the dry lake bed into a mirror of cruel light, reflecting hangars that shouldn't have been there, long, low structures that seemed to crouch against the mountains as if hiding from God himself. This was Waterton. That's what they called it in whispers, the ones who knew. A temporary site, they promised, for Lockheed's Skunk Works division to test Clarence Kelly Johnson's mad dream. An aircraft that could fly so high the Soviets couldn't touch it. A metal angel soaring 70,000 feet above the earth to photograph every missile silo, every submarine pen, every secret Stalin's ghost left behind in the permafrost. The Cold War didn't announce itself with trumpets. It crept in on wolf's paws, settling into the American psyche like radiation you can't see but know is there, changing you at the cellular level. By 1955, we'd already watched the Rosenbergs die in the electric chair, watched McCarthy wave his lists like a prophet with locusts in his throat. We needed eyes in the sky. We needed to know if they were coming, how many, how soon. So we built Waterton in the desert skeleton, and we sent men like Captain Elias Thorne into the thin membrane between heaven and oblivion. Thorne, 32 years old, Air Force, face like chiseled granite that had started to crack around the eyes from squinting at sun and classified briefings. He wasn't the first to fly the U-2 from Groom Lake, but he was among those early ghosts, a composite of men whose names you'd recognize if the files weren't still sealed in warehouses in Maryland. Men like Francis Gary Powers before his famous downing, like Article 349's test pilots whose families were told they worked desk jobs in Sacramento. Thorne kept a journal, contraband really, scratching thoughts into a pocket notebook during the long desert nights when sleep wouldn't come because the silence was too loud. July 26th, flew to Angels 68 today. Pressure suit makes you feel like you're buried alive, breathing your own exhaust. Saw something on approach, ruins, petroglyphs maybe, near the South Ridge. Ancient spirals carved by people who watched these same stars before we taught them to fear the sky. There's a truth buried in that observation. The Paiute and Shoshone marked these lands for millennia, left their astronomy in stone, their stories about sky beings and sacred peaks. Then we arrived with our own sky beings, classified, experimental, wrapped in aluminum and secrecy. The old myths and the new ones colliding in the same thin air. The acrid tang of JP4 jet fuel mixed with sagebrush dust, a perfume of progress and desolation. Inside the cockpit, if you could call that cramped metal womb a cockpit, instruments glowed with a dim, almost ecclesiastical light. The U-2 wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed to succeed where the B-47 reconnaissance flights failed, where balloons couldn't reach, where the Soviets' MiG-15s couldn't climb. 70 feet of wingspan, fragile as a dragonfly, powerful as a prayer. Thorne's hand on the stick, steady despite the shudder. That's the part that haunts me when I read the files, the ones that survived the shredder. His handwriting didn't shake. Even when he reported the anomalies, compass needles spinning, radio-static forming patterns that sounded almost like language, the sensation of time stretching or compressing during high-altitude runs, his script remained level, disciplined. August 2nd, control says the equipment's fine. Ran diagnostics 3 times. But up there, I swear the mountains moved, not physically, like they were breathing or I was seeing through them. Doc says it's hypoxia, maybe, but hypoxia doesn't write itself into your instruments. This is where history becomes something else, something that tastes of myth without quite crossing that threshold. The CIA's documents, now partially declassified, confirm Watertown, officially designated as Area 51, on maps in 1958, though the name leaked earlier through contractor gossip and pilot dark humor. They confirm the U-2 program's desperate timeline, how we needed those photos before Eisenhower's open skies proposal collapsed, before Khrushchev's temper turned from bluster to missiles. They don't confirm the other reports, the ones typed on onion skin paper with "Do Not File" stamped across the top. Psychological evaluations noting persistent derealization episodes among pilots. Maintenance logs recording instrument failures that corrected themselves. The recurring motif in their journals, echoes of forgotten wings. That phrase, Thorne used it first, I think, though two other pilots, names still redacted, wrote variations. Heard echoes of something that flew here before us. Wings in the static old wings. As if the desert remembered every aircraft that ever crossed it, every indigenous prayer for rain, every B-29 that limped home from Pacific runs during the war, and played them back through the electromagnetic spectrum at 70,000 feet, where the air's so thin you're barely still on Earth. Thorne's journal, September 15, 1955. Up here, God and the devil fly side by side, and I'm not sure which one I'm chasing. The crash report came 3 weeks later. 16 lines, 12 of them redacted, black bars like prison windows in paper form. The visible text, aircraft recovered, pilot condition, then nothing but ink and silence. That's what empires are built on when they can't afford truth. The crash report's black bars became a template, a grammar for the language Area 51 would speak for the next 4 decades. But behind those redactions, something was being born, not just aircraft, but a new kind of American mythology, forged in shadow and jet fuel, where the line between strategic necessity and collective madness grew thin as the contrails dissolving over Papoose Lake. The rumble of classified briefings replaced desert wind. Imagine blast doors 3 feet thick ceiling conference rooms where colonels and contractors spoke in acronyms that tasted like copper on the tongue: Project Aquatone, OXCART, Senior Crown, each one a prayer to outrun Soviet radar, Soviet missiles, Soviet time itself. This wasn't paranoia. The files prove that much, at least. By late 1956, Groom Lake had metastasized from Watertown's temporary shacks into something permanent, something hungry. New hangars rose like steel cathedrals, their corrugated walls shimmering in heat that could cook a man's thoughts if he stood outside too long. Inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, fluorescent lights buzzing with the trapped insect persistence of secrets trying to escape. Kelly Johnson, now there's a name that deserves its own mythology. Lockheed Skunk Works genius, the man who could sketch an aircraft on a napkin that would redefine what impossible meant. He walked those hangars with the eyes of someone who saw not metal but potential, not titanium but transcendence. His engineers followed like disciples, white coats moving like phantoms through the cathedral gloom, their faces illuminated by welding torches that sparked constellations against the dark. The metallic tang of those sparks mixed with ozone and coffee gone cold hours ago, the perfume of obsession. I've spent years in the archives, pulling files the Freedom of Information Act pried loose like teeth from a stubborn jaw. Sometimes, in the margins of technical specifications, you find handwriting, notes that weren't meant to survive, weren't supposed to be filed but were, probably by some clerk who didn't know better or knew too well. One margin note dated March 1957, beside schematics for the U-2's camera array. How do we photograph their souls before we photograph their silos? Someone crossed it out, but not well enough. The pen stroke was hesitant, ashamed maybe. The pilots kept coming. Powers, Stockman, Erickson, names that would become declassified and hundreds more that wouldn't. They trained in isolation that felt like punishment even when it was called preparation. Their families received addresses in Nevada that led to post office boxes. Their wives learned to smile at neighborhood barbecues when asked where exactly their husbands worked, learned to say government stuff with just enough boredom to kill further questions. The children grew up knowing daddy's job was the thing you didn't mention at school, the gap in conversation where normal fathers' occupations should be. By 1960, the U-2 wasn't enough. Soviet technology crept upward like vines reclaiming a ruin. The MiG-19s could climb higher now, the SA-2 surface-to-air missiles could reach farther. Powers would learn that the hard way over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960, his U-2 blown apart at 70,000 feet, his body and his secrets plummeting through thin air that offered no forgiveness, no second chances. But before that fall, and this is where history takes on the texture of fever dream, Area 51 had already birthed something faster, something that shouldn't have been possible given the materials science of the era. The A-12 Oxcart. They called it that prosaically, as if labeling a farm vehicle instead of a Mach 3 plus titanium miracle that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of violent inspiration. Its development pulled in metallurgists who had to invent new alloys, aerodynamicists who had to unlearn everything they thought they knew about airflow at extreme speeds. Titanium came from the Soviet Union, ironically. We bought it through shell companies. Or that would return to haunt its country of origin in the form of surveillance runs so fast the pilots experienced time dilation, their watches running slow against ground clocks, relativity made tangible in Nevada's forbidden skies. A young mechanic, his personnel file lists him as Michael Reese, 24, fresh from MIT with hands that could coax precision from chaos, kept notes in the dead of night during the Oxcart tests. I found them tucked into a maintenance log from 1963, pages that should have been destroyed but survived through bureaucratic oversight or divine intervention. I'm not sure which matters more. His handwriting, cramped, urgent. July 12, these birds aren't built for war, they're built to outrun ghosts. Watch the A-12 today on its test run. Climbed so fast it left its own sound behind, broke Mach before we even registered the takeoff on our instruments. The pilots come back different, not traumatized exactly, transformed, like they've seen something we're building toward but can't name yet. Wonder curdles into melancholy if you leave it in the desert sun long enough. The triumphs were real. U-2 photographs of Soviet missile installations in Cuba, October 1962, Kennedy's hand trembling slightly as he studied them. 13 days of the world balanced on images captured by pilots who flew alone into hostile airspace with nothing but skill and luck between them and oblivion. But the cost. The isolation's toll measured not in casualties, though there were those, crashes logged as training accidents, pilots whose gravestones lied about how they died, but in the slow erosion of certainty. What were we becoming in our efforts to survive? The recurring whispers appeared in new forms. Radio transcripts, encrypted but later declassified with those familiar black bars, pilots reporting phenomena that defied protocol. November 1964, A-12 test flight, call sign Sledgehammer. Control, I've got anomalies up here, like shadows with wings pacing me at Angels 78. Negative on visual confirmation, but the instruments, Jesus, control, the instruments see them. Response after a 7-second delay. Copy, Sledgehammer, maintain heading, disregard anomalies. But you can't disregard what etches itself into the ruins below. Ruins don't announce themselves with fanfare. They accumulate quietly like sediment until you're standing in them and realize the ground beneath your feet is composed entirely of forgotten things. The anomalies those pilots reported, shadows with wings, instruments registering presences that shouldn't exist, those were echoes but not of aircraft. They were echoes of the men themselves, their voices bouncing back from futures they'd never reach, warnings from the lives they were burning through like rocket fuel. The pilots. Let's talk about the pilots, because that's where history stops being data and becomes blood. Bob White flew the X-15 on July 17, 1962, reaching 314,750 feet, 59 miles up, where the sky turns black at noon and Earth curves beneath you like a blue thought that might vanish if you blink. He described it once years later, voiced gravelly with age and something else, something that tasted like regret. You crossed the Armstrong line at 63,000 feet, where your blood would boil without a pressure suit. After that, you're not flying. You're dying very slowly while pretending to be alive. The X-15 wasn't based at Groom Lake. That honor went to Edwards. But White's words could have belonged to any of them, the Spectral test pilots who strapped themselves into machines designed by geniuses who never had to test their own calculations with their own bodies. The pressure suits. God, the pressure suits. Full-pressure garments that took 45 minutes to put on, sealing you inside layers of rubberized fabric and metal rings that compressed your flesh, your breath, your thoughts into something compact enough to survive where humans had no business being. They felt like coffins in the making, and the pilots knew it. Called them bags with dark humor that wasn't really humor at all. The bone-rattling vibration of takeoff. Imagine your skeleton trying to separate from your muscles, every rivet in the aircraft telegraphing its structural stress directly into your vertebrae. The thin air at altitude tasted of ozone and regret, metallic and sharp, as if you were breathing the future's disappointment in your present choices. The Janet flights deserve mention here, though their story runs quieter than the prototypes they serviced. Those unmarked 737s, white with red stripes, no airline markings, shuttling workers from Las Vegas to Groom Lake since the 1970s, though the program started earlier with different aircraft, humbler transports. The crews who flew them, the passengers who rode in silence, sworn to secrecy about their destination. Their ghosts too, faces blurred in memory, names absent from narratives that focus on the sexy aircraft, the record-breaking flights. But they kept the place breathing. Every classified janitor, every anonymous cook serving breakfast in bunkers where sunlight was a rumor, every technician whose job title was consultant on their tax returns, they're part of this haunting. Elias Thorne's son. I should tell you about him, though even that feels like violation, pulling back curtains on pain that preferred darkness. Captain David Thorne, SR-71 Blackbird pilot, 1974–1978, following his father into skies that had already claimed the old man's sanity if not his life. The crash report's redactions left that ambiguous, deliberately so. David flew the Blackbird from Beale Air Force Base primarily, but the Nevada test runs brought him home to Groom Lake, and that's where the inheritance became unbearable. He wrote letters. His sister kept them, though she shouldn't have, technically, operational security and all that. One letter, dated November 1976, his handwriting neat but somehow desperate in its precision. Dad said the skies were empty, but I hear them whispering my name. At Mach 3, time does strange things, not physics, I understand that part. It's the psychological time, the subjective experience of moving so fast that weather systems beneath you are static, that you're outrunning your own radio transmissions. You become your own ghost, haunting the space you just occupied. I think Dad felt that too, and it broke something in him. Declassified reports from the CIA's Medical Oversight Division, obtained through FOIA requests that took 11 years to process, reveal patterns. Pilots experiencing vivid hallucinations during high-altitude reconnaissance missions, attributing them to hypoxia, lack of oxygen to the brain, or pressure suit malfunctions. But reading between the clinical lines, you sense the doctor's uncertainty. One report regarding an unnamed SR-71 pilot in 1977 notes, "Subject insists visions were not hallucinations but memories from flights I haven't flown yet. Psychological evaluation pending." The evaluation's results, redacted. The pilot's subsequent career, redacted. His fate, you can guess. It's funny how triumph feels like loss when you're flying alone. That's not quite right. Funny's the wrong word, but there isn't a right word for what I mean. These weren't cowboys, despite how we've mythologized them. They were poets of the void, scribbling love letters home from bunkers where time stood still, where the calendar on the wall might say 1975, but the atomic clocks in the lab downstairs measured something different. Nanoseconds accumulating into philosophical questions about whether they were still living in the same present as their families. The yellowed letters found in the ruins, and yes, there are ruins now, abandoned hangars at Groom Lake's periphery where earlier structures collapsed under decades of neglect and secrecy's weight. Those letters carry the recurring echoes. To my darling, I flew today where stars touch Earth and I couldn't tell which was which. To my son, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I taught you to look up instead of around. The paper smells of dust and old ink, stories preserved by accident in the desert's dry embrace. What pulls me back even now poring over these fragments is the unease. Not fear, these weren't fearful men, but unease, that subtler poison. The sense that their achievements, every speed record and altitude ceiling shattered, every successful reconnaissance mission over hostile territory, every technological miracle that kept America ahead in the Cold War's aerial arms race, all of it somehow tilted toward something else. Toward revelation or damnation, or the space where those concepts lose distinction. The crashed prototype's wreckage was found in 1989, though the crash dated to 1968, 21 years hidden in a canyon south of Papoose Lake, twisted metal holding secrets that erosion finally exposed. Its designation remains classified. Its purpose speculated but unconfirmed. But in the cockpit, what remained of the cockpit, investigators found a flight recorder that shouldn't have been there, technology decades ahead of 1968's capabilities, and a journal entry scratched into the instrument panel with something sharp. They were right. The shadows are us. 3 words scratched into metal by a hand that knew it was leaving the last message it would ever leave. That's where history stops pretending to be objective and admits it's been ghost story all along. The wreckage spoke in tongues that investigators wouldn't translate, at least not in the official reports. But the unofficial murmurs, the ones shared over drinks in Vegas hotel bars where contractors thought the walls weren't listening, those told different stories. Stories about how the metal was still warm after 21 years, how Geiger counters clicked lazy rhythms near the fuselage that had no business being radioactive, how the photographs taken at the site came back from development fogged, light struck, as if something wanted to remain unseen. We need to talk about the Foo Fighters, though the term feels almost quaint now, borrowed from World War II bomber crews who saw lights dancing around their B-17s over Germany. But the sightings didn't stop in 1945. Declassified U-2 mission reports, fragments of them anyway, the rest still locked in vaults at Langley, mention glowing orbs at 70,000 feet, where nothing should be glowing, where nothing should be except pilots and their prayers. June 1957, over the Urals during a reconnaissance run, unidentified luminous objects pacing aircraft, maintaining constant relative position despite evasive maneuvers. No radar signature, no heat signature, just light and the way it made my teeth ache. They told themselves it was Soviet tricks, experimental weapons, psychological warfare, holographic projections, anything that fit inside the box of explainable phenomena. But you can hear the doubt in the debriefing transcripts, the pauses between words where certainty used to live. The CIA attributed most sightings to high-altitude ice crystals, lenticular clouds, or simple misidentification under extreme stress conditions. Standard explanations. Safe explanations. The kind that let everyone sleep at night without wondering if the arms race had opened doors that didn't lock from the inside. The Sverdlovsk incident, May 1, 1960, you know that story. Powers shot down, captured, paraded on Soviet television like a caught fish, Eisenhower's denials unraveling in real time, the Paris summit collapsing into recriminations and barely contained fury. That's the history textbook version. What the textbooks don't mention, because it remained classified until a partial disclosure in 2010, is Powers' statement during his initial CIA debriefing after his release. My instruments went haywire 15 minutes before the missile struck. Compass spinning, altimeter reading impossible numbers, negative altitude like I was flying underground. Time felt wrong, stretched out, compressed. I radioed for confirmation and the voice that responded. He stopped there in the transcript. The interviewer prompted him 3 times. Finally, the voice sounded like mine but older, decades older, warning me to turn back. They attributed it to hypoxia, pre-impact stress, Soviet electronic warfare. Take your pick from the menu of rational explanations. Powers never spoke of it publicly. Died in a helicopter crash in 1974, a footnote to his own legend. Tony LeVere, legendary test pilot, flew the U-2's predecessor, the Lockheed U-2's developmental aircraft, and later served as chief pilot for Area 51's early operations. Gave an interview in 1987 to a researcher whose credentials were impeccable and whose recordings were subsequently lost, then found, then classified, then partially released with 40% of the audio redacted. I've heard the surviving portions. His voice trembles with something beyond age. It wasn't the Reds I feared. We knew what they had more or less, could calculate the risks, but there was something else up there with us in those skies over Nevada. Light that followed you home even after you'd landed, debriefed, showered, tried to sleep. You'd see it in your peripheral vision just at the edge of your window. And the radio signals, Christ, the radio signals. They'd come through on frequencies we weren't using, shouldn't have existed, voices that sounded like they were coming from somewhere parallel. Magnetic anomalies over Groom Lake are documented fact, geological quirks that play havoc with navigational equipment. That's the scientific explanation, and it's true as far as it goes. But it doesn't go far enough to explain why pilots reported their compasses spinning counterclockwise, not just malfunctioning, but moving in deliberate patterns, as if pointing towards something that existed outside normal directional frameworks. North, south, east, west, and then some fifth direction that doesn't have a name in English or Russian or any human language. The cold sweat of a cockpit at 70,000 feet is different from any other cold sweat you'll experience. It's not fear exactly, though fear's there. It's the body's recognition that T's somewhere it shouldn't be, that the thin membrane of technology and will keeping you alive could fail at any moment, and the fall would take long enough for you to contemplate every choice that led you to that point. Stars don't twinkle at that altitude. They stare, steady and accusatory, as if watching a transgression in progress. Some pilots spoke of this openly in their later years. Others took it to graves marked with lies about how they spent their careers. I've chased these stories across dusty archives in Maryland, Nevada, Virginia, through FOIA requests that came back so redacted they looked like abstract art, through interviews with aging men who spoke in careful euphemisms, and then, sometimes after the recording stopped, said what they really meant. And sometimes, in the quiet of those archive rooms, fluorescent lights humming their trapped insect dirge, I wonder if we're the ghosts, haunting our own creations, trying to understand what we built and what built us in return. The forgotten whispers manifested in new ways as the decades progressed. Radio operators at Groom Lake began logging anomalous signals in the mid-1960s, transmissions on abandoned military frequencies, voices that sounded human but spoke in syntax that didn't quite parse, messages that seemed to be responses to conversations that hadn't happened yet or had happened years before. One log entry, October 1967, receiving transmission, male voice, American accent. Call sign Phantom, requesting permission to land, no aircraft on radar, no flight plan on file. Transmission continues for 6 minutes then ceases. Phantom was Captain Thorne's call sign. Captain Thorne crashed in 1955. The space-age victories we celebrate, the moon landings and spy satellite successes, they're real. They deserve their glory. But isolation, physical, psychological, existential, breeds melancholy that no ticker-tape parade can cure. The pilots who returned from the edge brought back more than photographs and data. They brought back questions that burrowed into the national psyche, made homes in the spaces between what we claimed to know and what we suspected. The forbidden test flight log surfaced in 2003, part of a mistaken declassification batch that was immediately reclassified once someone realized what had been released, but not before copies were made. Project designation, DARKSTAR, date March 1969, pilot redacted, aircraft type redacted, purpose, high-altitude reconnaissance of phenomenon designated threshold. The final entry logged at 04:47 hours, approaching Angels 95, instruments failing. No, not failing, translating, reading altitudes in dimensions that shouldn't exist. Can see the base below but also above and sideways and through time. There's something out here, it's not watching us. We're watching it, we're the experiment we've always been. The transmission ended there. Mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-revelation. As if someone or something had reached through the electromagnetic spectrum and severed the connection with a knife made of silence. What followed wasn't contained in official histories, but in the shadows between them, in the negative space where classified projects left their impressions like bodies pressed into ash. The 1970s descended on Area 51 like a fever breaking, bringing with it a new generation of aircraft that didn't just fly, they vanished, both literally and metaphorically. Have Blue, the angular ghost that would father the F-117 Nighthawk, made its first flight from Groom Lake in December 1977, a faceted diamond carved from radar-absorbent materials and desperation. Lockheed's engineers had created something that bent physics around it, that drank radar waves instead of reflecting them, that looked like it had been designed by beings who understood geometry in dimensions humans only theorized about. But stealth came with a price nobody wrote into the budgets. The pilots who flew Have Blue, 2 prototypes, both crashed, one killing its pilot, reported sensations that didn't belong in debriefing reports, instrument readings that changed depending on who was looking at them, temporal discrepancies where flight duration didn't match elapsed ground time, And the whispers, always the whispers, over frequencies that shouldn't have existed, in voices that sounded like precedent. Like history talking to itself, across decades that hadn't happened yet. Tanapa Test Range, 50 miles northwest of Groom Lake, became operational in 1979, another hole in the map where secrets went to breed. The Reagan era expanded the black world exponentially, billions flowing into programs with code names like Have Donut and Constant Peg, facilities where captured Soviet aircraft were flown against American prototypes in Mach combat that was real in every way except the paperwork. Pilots who served there came back different, their eyes carrying the same haunted quality I'd seen in photographs of men who'd flown from Groom Lake 30 years earlier. Time collapsed in those places. The Cold War became a loop, repeating its traumas in increasingly sophisticated machinery. The UAP reports intensified during this period. I've cross-referenced the timelines, matched them against weapons tests and prototype flights, and the correlation is undeniable even if the causation remains obscure. December 1980, December 1984, March 1987, dates that appear in both classified flight logs and unexplained phenomena databases, declassified decades later with the kind of reluctant transparency that answers no questions while confirming all suspicions. Pilots logging aerial anomalies that performed maneuvers no aircraft could survive, that accelerated from stationary to hypersonic in seconds, that appeared on radar as solid returns one moment and vanished the next like thoughts you couldn't quite hold. I've imagined these moments 1,000 times, piecing together redacted files, cross-referencing surviving logbooks with crash investigation reports that end in black bars and bureaucratic ellipses. And each time, the dread feels a little more real, like a shadow in the room that grows darker the more you try to illuminate it. Captain James Thorne, Elias' grandson, third generation to fly into Nevada's forbidden skies, strapped into the cockpit of an experimental craft in November 1985. The aircraft's designation remains classified to this day, though speculation suggests it was related to the TR-3 program, a rumored black triangle that may or may not have existed depending on which former contractor you believe after their third beer. James inherited more than his grandfather's profession. He inherited the dreams, the waking nightmares where flight became falling and falling became transcendence. His pre-flight psych evaluation, partially declassified in 2018, noted, "Subject exhibits extreme competence coupled with fatalistic acceptance of mortality." When asked about family legacy, stated, "Grandpa warned me, these skies don't forgive the curious, but curiosity's all we've got left after we've exhausted courage." The test flight launched at 03:15 hours, darkness absolute except for the stars that watched with what might have been pity or hunger. Hard to tell from 70,000 feet where human emotions thin out with the oxygen. His HUD flickered with impossible readings, negative altitude again, that recurring motif, but also temporal coordinates that made no sense. 1955, 1969, 2003 all displayed simultaneously as if the aircraft existed across multiple decades at once. Ghostly silhouettes appeared on his targeting system, phantom aircraft matching his flight path perfectly, their call signs scrolling across the display: Phantom, Sledgehammer, Dark Star. His voice over the intercom, breaking with static and something else, something that sounded like recognition: Contour. "All I'm seeing, they're all here. Everyone who flew these skies, not ghosts, echoes. We're all echoing each other forward and backward. The missions never end, they just loop, and every time we fly we're flying with everyone who flew before and everyone who will fly after. Grandpa, if you can hear this, if time works the way I think it does up here, I understand now. You weren't crazy. The skies don't forgive the curious because curiosity breaks the loop, and the loop is all that holds us together." The G-forces pressed like invisible hands from forgotten gods, trying to reshape him into something capable of understanding what he was seeing. The horizon tilted, not mechanically but metaphysically, becoming a vortex where sand and stars spiraled into configurations that hurt to perceive, geometries that existed outside Euclidean constraints. This was Icarus's final moment extended into eternity. The split second between hubris and consequence stretched across decades of secret flights, classified crashes, men who flew too close not to the sun but to whatever burned beyond it. The echoes of forgotten wings crescendoed into a roar that drowned out engine noise, radio chatter, heartbeat, thought. America's stealth edge in the Cold War, purchased with souls nobody counted in the victory calculations. The F-117 would go operational in 1983, would perform flawlessly in Desert Storm, would give us air superiority that seemed like magic to those who didn't know the cost. But magic always requires sacrifice. Ancient principles applied to modern warfare. James Thorne's final transmission came at 04:47 hours, same time as the Darkstar log 16 years earlier, coincidence that feels like providence. Control, I'm going to follow them. The others, they're showing me where the loop breaks, where we can stop echoing and start. Static, then silence. Then a search and rescue operation that found wreckage scorched into the desert floor in patterns that matched no known impact profile, twisted metal that was still warm 3 days later, instruments fused into configurations that looked almost like language if you squinted hard enough and didn't care about your sanity. The ruins keep their silent vigil, weathering under Nevada sun that shows no mercy to secrets or men. But silence, I've learned, is rarely absolute. It's filled with smaller sounds, the desert reclaiming what we abandoned, grain by grain, wind by patient wind. Walk with me through the remnants, not the operational areas, those remain forbidden, guarded by jurisdiction and consequence, but the periphery, the places where the Cold War's fever broke and left behind its cooling corpse. Groom Lake's dry bed stretches white and cracked, a canvas where tire tracks from classified aircraft fade like ancient cave paintings, stories told in tread patterns that made no civilian sense. The hangars that once buzzed with fluorescent urgency now stand hollow, their blast doors rusted half open like mouths trying to speak, but forgetting the words. This is what the 1990s brought. Drawdown, consolidation, the Soviet Union's collapse rendering certain obsessions obsolete while birthing new ones. Facilities that housed programs like Article 341. That's the 1959 crash I mentioned earlier, an A-12 prototype that augured in during a test flight, pilot killed instantly. Wreckage classified at a level that suggested they'd found something in the debris they couldn't explain. These facilities were mothballed, stripped of their useful components, left to the elements and the rumors. The scoot and shoot silos, rapid deployment hangars designed to get experimental aircraft airborne in under 3 minutes, stood empty by 1995, their doors mechanically frozen in various stages of opening, creating these strange industrial yawns across the landscape. People who live in Rachel, Nevada, the tiny town closest to the base, population maybe 50 on a good day, they'll tell you about the lights. Not the famous ones, not the supposed UFOs that bring tourists with cameras and credulity. The other lights, flickering inside abandoned structures where the power was cut decades ago. Radar systems at the distant edges of the range that occasionally register returns from impossible altitudes, targets that appear for 3 sweeps of the antenna and then vanish like they were never there at all. Residual energies, skeptics call them, electromagnetic anomalies from years of high-powered equipment. But the old-timers, the ones who worked the base before retirement, before their NDAs expired or their consciences overrode them, they call them something else. Echoes. Pilots' spirits manifest not as bedsheet ghosts, but as electromagnetic signatures, flight paths recorded into the desert's magnetic substrate, playing back endlessly on nights when atmospheric conditions align just right. I don't believe in ghosts, or rather, I believe in them differently than spiritualists do. The dead don't haunt places, memories haunt places, and memories are electromagnetic, neurons firing in patterns we can barely map, storing experiences in chemical architectures that science still doesn't fully understand. Who's to say those patterns can't imprint on the world outside our skulls? Who's to say Nevada's bedrock, subjected to decades of exotic radiation and electromagnetic pulses from experimental propulsion systems, didn't learn to remember? The rusted fuselages lie half-buried in dunes south of Papoose Lake, their origins classified even in decay. I've stood among them during research trips sanctioned by FOIA victories and careful persistence, touched metal that was once cutting-edge and is now just cut. Paint peels like old skin, revealing primer coats in colors that don't appear in standard military palettes, deep purples, iridescent greens that shift in sunlight, blacks that seem to absorb more than just visible spectrum. The air smells of forgotten rain, that petrichor scent mixed with oxidized aluminum and something else, something faintly metallic and organic at once, like blood left too long in the sun. Henry Vasquez, retired ground crewman, 73 years old, worked Groom Lake from 1968 to 1989. Saw the transition from U-2s to Blackbirds to things he still won't name even though his NDA expired in 2014. I met him in Rachel, at the Little Elaine, the alien-themed bar and motel that's become the town's entire economy, and he agreed to drive me out to the ruins on the public side of the border, the places where you can stand without risking federal prosecution. We sat on the hood of his truck, November wind carrying dust devils across the lake bed, and he spoke in the slow cadence of someone who's rehearsed these thoughts for decades but never said them aloud. "We built empires in the sky," he murmured, eyes tracking something I couldn't see, maybe aircraft that existed only in his memory's persistence. "Fastest planes in the world, stealthiest, most advanced. Gave America a technological edge that won a war nobody thought would stay cold. But down here," he gestured at the ruins, at the windswept nothing that surrounded us. "Down here it's just us and the ghosts left behind, not of people necessarily, of ambition, of the cost we didn't count because we were too busy counting victories. These places aren't just ruins, they're mirrors, reflecting the hubris of a nation that reached for the stars while burying its dead in unmarked graves with classified headstones. Short breaths of wonder, look at what we achieved, what heights we scaled, what boundaries we shattered. Long sighs of melancholy, look at what it cost, who we sacrificed, what we became in the process of not becoming Soviet. The rhythm of it, victory and loss trading places, until you can't tell which is which. Until the distinction seems like propaganda we told ourselves to sleep better. In my research, I've touched these artifacts. Really touched them, not just photographed or cataloged, but pressed my palms against cold metal and felt something, call it imagination. Call it transference of my own emotional investment into inanimate objects. Call it the chill of November wind in the high desert. But it felt like recognition. Like the ruins recognized me as someone trying to remember on their behalf, and they were grateful or warning me or both simultaneously. Who listens when the whispers fade? That's the question that haunts me more than any ghost story. The narratives endure through channels the government never anticipated. Oral histories collected by researchers who care more about truth than clearance levels. Leaked memos that find their way to archives through paths nobody can quite trace. Deathbed confessions from engineers and pilots who decide, in their final years, that secrecy matters less than legacy. These stories circulate in the marginal spaces, conspiracy forums and academic conferences, bar conversations and documentary films, keeping alive the memory of men who flew into oblivion with nothing but courage and curiosity, who tested the edges of what metal and flesh could endure, who died or didn't die in ways that official records will never clarify. America's resilient spirit shines through somehow even in the shadows. We reached, we failed, we reached again. The ruins stand as testament not to perfection but to persistence, to the stubborn human refusal to accept limits even when limits would have been wiser. And the whispers, those forgotten whispers that began as echoes of engines and evolved into something stranger, they've softened now into breezes stirring dust, gentle enough to ignore if you're not listening carefully. But some of us listen. Some of us have to. Because the alternative is letting these stories dissolve into the same desert wind that scours away tire tracks and ambition, leaving nothing but sand and the nagging sense that something important happened here, once, though we can't quite remember what. Twilight settles over Groom Lake like a shroud, purple and indigo bleeding across the sky in ways that make the mountains look like they're exhaling secrets. This is the hour when the desert belongs to itself again, when the wild things emerge, coyotes and kit foxes, sidewinders drawing cursive in the cooling sand. A lone coyote's howl rises from somewhere near the hills, primal and mournful, a sound that predates nations and will outlast them, reminding us that all our classified aircraft and black budgets are temporary intrusions in landscapes that measure time in geological epochs, not fiscal years. The legacy of the Spectral test pilots resolves itself in paradoxes. They helped avert nuclear brinkmanship. That's documented fact. U-2 photographs of Soviet missile installations, SR-71 reconnaissance that confirmed treaty compliance, intelligence gathered at 70,000 feet that let diplomats negotiate from positions of knowledge instead of fear. The Cold War stayed cold partly because men like Powers and Thorne and their unnamed brothers flew into hostile airspace and came back, usually with proof of what we faced. Stealth technology born at Groom Lake gave America an edge that manifested in Desert Storm's opening hours, F-117 striking Baghdad with impunity, warfare becoming something asymmetrical and strange, surgical strikes replacing carpet bombing. Victories that felt like miracles to those who didn't know the cost. But the cost, always the cost, denominated in isolation and psychological fracture, in pilots who came home to families that couldn't understand where they'd been or what they'd seen, in marriages that dissolved under the pressure of secrets that couldn't be shared over dinner or in bed. The paranormal dread that seeped into their testimonies, was it real, or was it the mind's way of processing extremity, of translating experiences that exceeded normal human parameters into metaphors the psyche could survive? Does it matter? The dread was real to them. The isolation was absolute. And sometimes, reading their accounts, you sense that they glimpse something at the edge of what's possible, something that makes you question whether our neat divisions between natural and supernatural are just comforting fictions. Area 51 remains classified into the 21st century, though its existence is acknowledged now, grudgingly, with caveats and carefully crafted non-denials. The base continues operating. Satellite imagery confirms that much, shows new hangars and runways alongside the old, suggests programs that haven't been declassified and may never be. Bob Lazar's claims in 1989 about alien technology and element 115 and propulsion systems that bent spacetime, they've become part of the lore, impossible to verify or entirely debunk, existing in that liminal space between conspiracy theory and classified fact where truth gets strange and strangeness gets truthful. I won't litigate his credibility here. But his testimony, like the pilot's testimony, like the ruins themselves, adds to the atmospheric thickness, the sense that Nevada's skies have seen things that don't fit comfortably into official narratives. The fading glow of a distant runway light. I've seen it, standing at the legal perimeter near the black mailbox, that's actually white. That's actually a different mailbox than the original, tourists having stolen the first one for souvenirs, as if you could possess mystery by taking its signposts home. The light blinks lonely code across the distance, red and distant, and if you're in the right frame of mind, or wrong one depending on perspective, it tastes of salt and regret, as if the desert itself mourns what we built here and what we destroyed in the building. Sagebrush and creosote release their evening scents, medicinal and ancient, and the temperature drops fast, as it does in high desert, 60-degree swings that remind you how hostile this place is to human presence. How much engineering and will it took to make it operational? At the perimeter fence near Rachel, descendants gather sometimes. Not officially, not organized by anyone with authority, but through word of mouth and internet forums, people whose fathers or grandfathers flew from Groom Lake find their way to the border and stand looking at the mountains that hide the base, sharing tales that are part family history and part mythology. Impossible to separate truth from embellishment after decades of retelling. A woman in her 40s, whose grandfather flew U-2s in the early days, whose name I won't include because privacy matters more than verification. They flew for us into the unknown, and sometimes, I swear, the wind carries voices back, not words, just presence, like they're still up there, still flying eternal reconnaissance missions, watching over something we can't quite see. The emotional arc lands here in quiet wonder. The dread that built through crashed aircraft and redacted reports and pilots who reported seeing shadows with wings, it softens now, doesn't disappear but transforms into reverence. These men were neither heroes nor victims exclusively. They were humans doing what humans do, reaching beyond their grasp, testing limits, accepting risks in service of causes they believed transcended individual survival. Some of those causes were noble, some were paranoid. Most were both simultaneously, patriotism and fear mixing into compounds that powered an arms race nobody truly won. Though America outlasted the Soviet Union and claimed victory in a war where victory and survival were functionally identical. It's not an end, really. How could it be? These stories loop eternal like orbits unending, each telling reinforcing the last and launching the next. The echoes, those motifs we've tracked from forgotten wings to radio whispers to gentle breezes, they culminate now as a distant hum barely perceptible, the frequency of memory operating at the threshold of conscious awareness. You have to lean into silence to hear it, have to be willing to stand in ruins and listen with more than ears. And when you do, you feel nostalgia's ache, not for a specific past, but for the version of ourselves that believed reaching for stars justified any sacrifice, that assumed progress was linear and inevitable, that thought secrets could be kept forever, and costs could be deferred indefinitely. We were wrong about some of that, right about other parts. And in the space between wrong and right, Nevada's forbidden skies hold their counsel, revealing nothing, confirming less, existing as testament to human ambition's beautiful, terrible persistence. In those skies, if you believe the whispers, and after everything, I'm not sure what believing means anymore. The ghosts of black projects still fly. Not as supernatural entities, but as informational echoes, flight paths recorded in electromagnetic substrate, personalities imprinted through intensity of experience into the landscape they transformed and were transformed by. They watch over ruins where dreams and dread entwine forever, where the past refuses to stay past, where every sunset reminds us that secrecy and sacrifice built the world we inherited, for better and worse and everything between. The twilight deepens, the stars emerge, and somewhere over Groom Lake, an aircraft that may or may not exist climbs toward altitude, its contrail catching the last light, drawing a line between earth and heaven that will fade by morning but will be drawn again tomorrow. And tomorrow, as long as humans insist on flying where we don't belong.